Ronald Reagan stood in Ireland in 1984 in front of cameras and crowds and said something that sounded almost impossible for a president to admit. He told the world he never knew much about his background because his father was orphaned before he was 6 years old. Think about that for a second. Here is a man known for stories, for charm, for making America feel like a neighborhood. Yet when it came to his own roots, he grew up with a blank space where family history should have been. The penalty if you don't know this is you assume Reagan's Irish story was always a proud, polished family tale. You might think he grew up wearing green on St. Patrick's Day and reciting the names of villages in County Tipperary. The reward is you see the real reason he didn't. It wasn't secrecy. It wasn't shame. It was something simpler and sadder. The storyteller's father had no one left to tell him the story. Before Ronald Reagan became famous, he was just a boy in Illinois, living inside a family that moved often and carried trouble quietly. By the time Reagan was a child in the 1911 to 1920s period, the family was fully Americanized. That means the Irish identity was not something wrapped around daily life. It wasn't the center of the home. It was already fading into the background, especially under stress. And there was stress. Reagan's father was Jack Reagan, born in 1883 in Illinois. Jack's early life held a harsh fact that breaks the chain of memory. Jack lost both parents before he was 6. His own father, Michael Reagan, died in 1890 when Jack was about 7. His mother, Catherine, had passed earlier. Either way, the result is clear. Jack grew up without parents. No mother to tell him who his people were. No father to pass down names, places, stories. No immigrant grandparents alive to point a finger at a map and say, "That's where we came from." That is the first mini-drama, and it's the kind that doesn't look dramatic in a movie way, but it changes everything in real life. Jack's problem was loss at the exact age when children learn who they are. A child doesn't choose to be orphaned, but the consequence is the key point. The oral history of the family gets severed. It doesn't get handed down. It disappears. So when Ronald Reagan grows up later, he grows up with the effect of that loss. He grows up in a family where Irish ancestry exists, but the details are missing. No stories about Tipperary told around a table. No old relatives speaking with the rhythm of another country. Add poverty, Jack's alcoholism, and frequent moves. Those are forces that push family storytelling out of the center. When a family is trying to get through the week, the past can feel like a luxury. This is where Reagan's story becomes even more personal. Ronald Reagan is famous for confidence and ease, but in the one place that often builds a person's sense of belonging, he had a gap. He wasn't raised with a detailed family legend. He was raised with what was right in front of him. A father shaped by early orphaning and a home that didn't have the older generation alive to anchor the past. On his mother's side, the home energy went into both values more than ethnic identity. The result is a young Reagan growing up without a clear origin tale. Now here's the part where the story becomes a surprise again, because the world changed Reagan's ancestry for him. Ronald Reagan won the election in November 1980, and almost right away, a different kind of race began. Not a race for votes, a race for a name. A race to find the exact Irish place his father's line came from. Because the truth is, Reagan's Irish roots were a mystery that people talked about, but nobody could pin down. Then, in late 1980, researchers from Debrett's Peerage and Baronetage solved it fast. They did it by following a paper trail step by step from the United States, back across the ocean, then into Irish Catholic baptismal registers. They didn't find a vague somewhere in Ireland. They found a parish, they found a register entry, they found a baptism date, they found a townland. If you don't look closely at this timeline, you might think Reagan's Irish identity was just a warm campaign theme, but the records show his roots were located with real documents right after his victory, and that discovery helped set up a very public, emotional connection that exploded into pride a few years later. Reagan didn't have to do anything for this search to start. His election victory did it. The moment he became president-elect in November 1980, curiosity sharpened into urgency. They started with what they could hold in their hands in the United States. They had Michael Reagan's 1884 Illinois death record. That record mattered because it anchored the family line in something official. From there, the trail didn't jump straight to Ireland. It moved through another place that surprises people when they hear it: London. Michael Reagan married Catherine Mulcahy in London in 1852. The key detail is that both of them were Irish-born. That is the kind of fact that makes a search feel suddenly possible. It means the Irish origin isn't just one person's story, it's a couple story. Two Irish-born people married in London, then the family line moved on. Debrett's researchers traced Reagan's paternal line back through U.S. records, through the London marriage, and then into Irish Catholic baptismal registers. And that's where they identified Ballyporeen Parish in County Tipperary. Not a county guess, not a family story, a parish, specifically the old Templetenny Parish. Then they found the exact entry that mattered most: Michael's baptism. The record shows Michael was baptized on September 3, 1829. It names him as the son of Thomas Regan and Margaret Murphy. It places the family in Dooley's townland. A townland is a small rural land division in Ireland. It is the kind of detail that makes the story feel real. County Tipperary is broad. Dooley's townland is the kind of pinpoint that people put their finger on. This discovery in late 1980 mattered because it turned Reagan's Irish roots from a fog into a clear address in history. It gave Reagan a specific place in Ireland to connect with, not in a vague way, but in a way people can travel to. Now we need to look at the ancestor himself, because Michael Reagan is the hinge in this paper trail. If you think Reagan's Irish story is just a simple famine escape story, you miss the sharper truth. His great-grandfather did not fly straight from Ireland to a bright American welcome. He took the long route. He left a dairy farming region in County Tipperary where small tenant farms could barely keep a family fed. The key detail here is timing. Michael was not leaving during the worst peak of the potato famine years of 1845 to 1852. He left in the early 1850s when the acute crisis had passed, but the damage remained. That matters because it changes the reason. This was not a sudden sprint away from one dramatic event. It was a hard decision to escape chronic rural destitution, land scarcity, and economic hardship. It was the slow grind that comes after catastrophe, when a place is still broken and opportunity is still missing. Michael had a choice. He could stay in Ballyporeen and keep trying to survive on what a small tenant life could offer. Or he could do what many young Irish men did in that era and take a stepping stone route. England first, for urban jobs, then, maybe, America. This matters because it shows planning under pressure, survival planning. So around 1851 or 1852, Michael left for London. London was not a dream. It was a crowded, harsh stop where Irish immigrants often landed in tight, poor areas. It was still a better chance than rural stagnation. After marriage, Michael worked as a soap maker. That job detail does real work in a story like this. Soap making is physical. It is messy. It tells you they were not living on wishful thinking. They were living on labor. The data places them in London's Irish ghetto in the Peckham area. Michael and Catherine were literate but poor. That combination is important. Literacy gives you a little power. It helps you read signs, letters, papers, job notices. Poverty limits everything else. Being literate but poor is like being able to see the door but not being sure you can open it. By the mid-1850s, they faced another choice: stay in London, where they had work but also lived in a crowded Irish ghetto, or push further and take the biggest gamble of all. America offered a promise that pulled especially hard for people from tenant backgrounds: land ownership, not rented land you could claim as yours. So in 1857 or 1858, they sailed to New York. Reagan's great-grandfather chased that exact thing in the most literal form: land. He left a small tenant world in Tipperary, tried London first, worked as a soap maker in an Irish ghetto, then crossed the ocean, poor but literate. That is not a neat tale of instant success. It is a tale of endurance. This brings us back to the man who would one day tell this story. Ronald Reagan could fill a room with warmth, then slip in a joke that landed like a tiny pin. One of his favorite pins was his own last name. He would talk about Reagan as if it were a story that had been dragged through mud, rinsed off, and hung up to dry. He didn't brag about nobles and castles first. He started with the missing O. He started with the messy spellings. He started with the idea that English clerks heard a Gaelic name, shrugged, and wrote down whatever sounded close. Then Reagan would smile and make the point sharp. Only poor, common laborers, only people with little schooling, would accept that kind of phonetic butchering and move on. He used the joke to say, "We weren't fancy," and in the same breath, he made the secret reveal. The Gaelic root, O Reagain, means descendant of the little king. That is the trick he loved. He could make you laugh at how humble his line looked on paper, then make you feel the thrill of royal origins hiding underneath. The name story begins in Gaelic. O Reagain means little king or king's child, but Anglicization, turning Irish Gaelic names into English-looking names, happened through time and pressure. The data says that after the Norman era, scribes often dropped the O and changed spellings based on sound. The same name could appear as Reagan, Regan, O'Regan, and other variations. A clerk heard a sound and wrote what fit the English ear. In Reagan's joke, the reason they accepted it was simple. They were poor and not highly educated. The missing O became evidence. If the family had been literate nobility, he suggested, they would have guarded the name. They would have corrected clerks. Instead, the spelling drifted. Reagan became Reagan. The O vanished. To Reagan, that drift told the real story. Common laborers, not titled lords. Now, flash forward to June 3rd, 1984. Ronald Reagan stood in Ballyporeen, Ireland, and the rain mattered because it forced him to do something small and human. He clutched a parish book close to his body, protectively, like it could be damaged and lost again. In that book was a line that changed his inner story. The baptismal register entry for his great-grandfather Michael Reagan, christened on September 3rd, 1829. Reagan showed that entry to reporters like a proud grandson showing a baby photo. Then he said something that sounded like relief more than politics. Now, thanks to you and efforts of good people who have dug into the history of a poor immigrant family, I know at last whence I came. He said it gave my soul a new contentment. He said it felt like coming home after a long journey. Before this day, Reagan's story had a gap. Not the kind of gap you fill with a quick online search, the kind that sits in a family for generations. He would later say that his father's orphaning severed the family history. When you don't know where you came from, you can still build a life, but part of your identity feels like a room with the lights off. You walk through it anyway. You bump into furniture. You learn to live with the darkness. Then one day, someone turns the light on, and you realize how long you were guessing. Reagan was not an academic looking for documents. He wasn't a scholar hunting footnotes. He was the President of the United States, traveling on a trip that had big political meaning for U.S.-Ireland bonds. Yet the emotional peak of the trip wasn't a big speech about alliances. It was a quiet moment in a local Roman Catholic church in Ballyporeen, standing near a baptismal font and a parish register. The font was the exact one used for his great-grandfather's baptism. That detail mattered to him because it made the past physical. Not back then, not somewhere. Right here, this stone, this water, this record. In the church, he attended a prayer service, then he saw the register, then he saw the entry. Suddenly the name Michael Reagan wasn't a floating ancestor. It was ink on a page tied to a date, September 3rd, 1829. Reagan's reaction wasn't cool and distant, it was protective. He held the parish book from the rain. That's a gesture that says, without words, this is mine now, don't let it be ruined. After the church, the story moves to a place that feels less holy, but just as important. A pub. On June 3, 1984, Ronald Reagan did something presidents almost never do in a foreign country. He walked into a small village pub like he belonged there. He didn't glide past it in a motorcade. He stepped into O'Farrell's pub in Ballyporeen, and the place exploded. People roared. Traditional Irish music filled the room. The owners, John and Mary O'Farrell, had already renamed a part of the pub the Ronald Reagan Lounge, like they were saving a seat for a cousin who'd been gone too long. And then the strangest little detail made it feel real. A pint of Smithwick's beer was handed to him directly. Reagan beamed. He raised the glass in a toast. He chatted warmly with locals. For a moment, the President of the United States looked less like a world leader and more like a man who had stumbled into a homecoming he didn't know he needed. If you think this was just a cute photo stop, you miss the stakes. The penalty is you file it under tour. The reward is you see what it meant. A village embracing him as one of their own, and Reagan leaning into that embrace as proof of roots rediscovered. The village's welcome made it tangible. It took ancestry out of paperwork and put it into a room full of faces. And here is the twist people don't expect. The pub didn't stay in Ireland. The interior of the pub itself was later shipped to the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. It reopened there as the Ronald Reagan Pub, sitting right under Air Force One. That is wild when you picture it. Not just a sign, not just a photo on a wall. The interior of the pub itself became an object carried across the ocean, planted in a museum-like setting. That turns a local welcome into a lasting symbol. It's like the pub itself followed him home. Reagan's sunny confidence did not appear out of thin air. It was built in a home where two different kinds of strength fought to keep the family steady. Jack, his Irish Catholic father, orphaned early, carried immigrant grit, charisma, and a sharp hatred of prejudice. He also carried alcoholism and a distance from religion. Nell, his Scottish Protestant mother, filled the spiritual gap with prayer meetings and a stubborn habit of seeing good in people. Reagan grew up taking something from each. Jack's stories and warmth, Nell's faith and steady goodness. When he later spoke with hope and calm certainty, he was not only performing, he was repeating the best parts of his parents' inheritance, turning a complicated family mix into a public voice that sounded like optimism with roots. Ronald Reagan stood in a small Irish town and did something presidents almost never do. He spoke like a man who had been missing a piece of himself and finally found it. He told the crowd he felt a joyous feeling. Then he said the line that flips the whole story. It was like coming home after a long journey. Most people assume Reagan always knew where he came from because he told stories for a living and seemed so sure of himself. But he spent much of his life in the dark about his own Irish roots. Not by choice, by a family break that happened before he was even born. 155 years since Michael left, and still the door opened. A president, in 1984 in Ballyporeen, not acting like a distant leader, but speaking like a man who found his missing origin story at last. He didn't just inherit an Irish story, he got an Irish address.